For 6 months, I let my son-in-law treat me like a tenant in my own home. What he didn't know was that I had already spoken to my attorney 3 weeks before any of it started. My name is Howard Bellamy. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer with the county of Multnomah, Oregon, and when I retired, I did what my late wife always wanted. I paid off the house in full, remodeled the kitchen, put in a proper reading room where her sewing table used to be, and started living. 3 bedrooms, a finished basement I'd converted into a proper study, a garage, and a half-acre yard that backed up against a walking trail. 1,200 square feet of peace and quiet. Mine outright. No mortgage, no liens, nothing. My wife Patricia passed 4 years ago from ovarian cancer. She never got to see the kitchen finished. I think about that every morning when I make coffee. My daughter Claire is 34. She's the kind of woman who apologizes before she speaks, who has spent her whole life trying not to take up too much space. I don't know where she got that from. Certainly not from me, and certainly not from her mother. Patricia would have cleared a room with a look. Claire, though. Claire folds herself small. She's been that way since she was a teenager, and I always thought she'd grow out of it. She didn't. She married a man named Derek. I know, common name, but that's what he was. No, actually, his name was Scott. Scott Lavery. She married Scott Lavery 6 years ago in a ceremony at a vineyard outside of Hood River, and I walked her down the aisle and I danced with her to a Patsy Cline song, and I thought, this man had better take care of my daughter. He was 36 at the time. Worked in commercial real estate, drove a Lexus he couldn't quite afford, wore clothes that were slightly too expensive for someone with slightly too much debt, and had a handshake that was just a half-second too firm. You know the type. For the first couple of years, things were fine. They had an apartment in Southwest Portland. Claire worked as a dental hygienist. Scott's income went up and down with the market, mostly down from what I could tell. Though he never said so directly, he had a talent for making failure sound like a temporary setback on the way to something larger. I tried to like him. I genuinely tried. Patricia liked him, or she was kind enough to pretend she did, which with her was sometimes the same thing. The trouble started, as trouble often does, quietly. Claire called me in November. They've been having some difficulties, she said. The apartment lease was up in February. Scott's latest deal had fallen through. She asked if they could stay with me for a few months, just until they got back on their feet. I said yes without hesitating. She is my daughter. Of course I said yes. They moved in on a Saturday in early February. I helped them carry boxes. Scott shook my hand at the door like I was the hotel concierge checking him in. He looked around the house. My house? The house Patricia and I bought in 1994. The house where Claire grew up, where she learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where we put a height chart on the door frame of the pantry that I have never been able to paint over, and he looked around at all of it like he was appraising it. Good bones, he said. I didn't say anything. The first month was fine, more or less. Claire cooked sometimes. Scott was out a lot. Networking, he called it. I stayed out of their way. They had the guest bedroom, the larger of the two because I wanted Claire to be comfortable. I kept to my routine. Coffee at 6, a walk on the trail by 7, back home by 8, the reading room by 9. Then Claire told me she was pregnant. I cried. I'm not ashamed to say it. I stood in the kitchen and I held my daughter, and I cried because Patricia wasn't there to hear it, and because I was going to be a grandfather, and because life keeps moving, even when you want it to stop for a moment and let you catch up. Scott smiled the smile of a man who had just been handed a negotiating position. It was 3 days later when he sat across from me at the kitchen table. My kitchen table, the oak one Patricia picked out at an estate sale in Lake Oswego. And he told me that with the baby coming, they were going to need more space. I agreed. That made sense. I told him we could look into adding a proper nursery, maybe converting the reading room. I had ideas. I was ready to help. That's not what he meant. He meant they needed my bedroom. The master bedroom. Patricia's room. The room with the ensuite bathroom and the walk-in closet and the window that looks out over the backyard where the dogwood tree blooms every April like clockwork. That room. He explained it very calmly, the way men like Scott explain things. The baby would need to be close to them at night. The guest room wasn't big enough for their furniture plus a crib. The master made the most sense. He had clearly rehearsed this. Claire was sitting beside him and she was looking at the table. I asked where he expected me to sleep. He said the basement study was actually very nice. He'd looked it over. With a little work, it could be quite comfortable. I want to be precise about what happened inside me in that moment, because it matters. There was no explosion. There was no shouting. What I felt was something cold and clarifying, like stepping outside in January. Something that said, "This is who this man is." And something else that said, "I've been waiting for this." I told him I'd think about it. He seemed surprised that I didn't argue. Claire looked up from the table for the first time. That night, I sat in the reading room, Patricia's reading room, the one with her books still on the shelves, and I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my attorney, a woman named Frances Gould, who has handled my affairs for 20 years and who does not waste words. The second was to my financial advisor. I told them both what was happening. Frances said, "Howard, don't move out of that bedroom." I said I wouldn't. I also did something else that night. I went to the hardware store and I bought 2 small audio recorders, the kind journalists use, perfectly legal in Oregon, which is a one-party consent state. You only need one party's consent to record a conversation. I was that party. I placed one in the kitchen, one in the living room. I told no one. I want to be clear about something. I was not setting a trap. I was protecting myself. There is a difference, though I understand how it might look similar from the outside. The next 2 months were the kind of slow erosion that you don't notice until you step back and look at the whole cliff face. Scott started making small comments about the house. The yard needed more work than he'd expected. The HVAC system was outdated. He'd talked to a buddy of his in contracting about the layout. Claire, I could see, was genuinely trying. She'd come sit with me in the evenings, ask about my day, bring me coffee the way I liked it. But there was always Scott in the background, recalibrating, reframing. The way he talked about the house shifted gradually from your house to the house to occasionally just here. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I kept recording. One evening in April, I came home from my walk earlier than usual. Scott was on the phone in the kitchen. I went in quietly to get water, and I heard him say to whoever was on the other end that his father-in-law was getting older and probably shouldn't be managing a property this size on his own, and that Claire was going to be the only heir anyway, and that it just made sense for them to take over the management of things sooner rather than later. I stood at the kitchen sink and drank my water, and he saw me, and he didn't even fully stop the conversation, just lowered his voice slightly and turned half away. I went back to the reading room and I sat down, and I thought about Patricia. I thought about the night we brought Claire home from the hospital. The way Patricia sat in the rocking chair in the nursery and said, "Howard, look what we made." I thought about 31 years of county work, of budgets and permits and infrastructure, of the pension I'd earned dollar by dollar, of the house I'd paid off at 62. I thought about the reading room with the books Patricia would never finish. And I thought no, not no to my daughter. Never that. No to this. I called Frances the next morning. I told her what I'd heard. I told her about the recordings. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Howard, I think it's time we talked about a few things. Here is what I did not know, and what I probably should have done years before. I did not have a will that was current. My estate planning was from 2009, before Patricia died, and it needed to be updated entirely. Frances said this was actually fortunate because it meant I could make changes now, clearly and with full documentation of my mental competence. That would be difficult to challenge later. We spent 3 weeks getting everything in order. New will. Revocable living trust. I put the house into the trust with me as the trustee. This meant that Scott's little theory about managing the property and anticipating the inheritance had just run into a legal wall he didn't know existed. I also, with Frances's guidance, reached out quietly to my bank and had some conversations about financial powers of attorney and account access that resulted in some additional protections I won't go into detail about, but which were thorough. All of this was done quietly, entirely within my rights. Nothing Scott could object to because Scott didn't know it was happening. In May, Scott asked me again about the bedroom situation. He framed it as a family conversation. He brought it up at dinner. Again, my table, my kitchen, my dishes, with Claire sitting there looking like she wanted to disappear. And he laid it out again, patient and reasonable, the way a man lays something out when he's certain of his ground. They were going to need the space. The basement had good bones. There was that phrase again. I could be comfortable down there. He'd even looked at some finished basement kits online. It would almost be like having my own apartment. My own apartment. My own apartment. In my own house. Claire reached over and put her hand on my arm. She said, "Dad, we're not trying to push you out. We just need to think about what makes sense for all of us." I looked at her for a long moment. My daughter, who folds herself small, my daughter, who has spent 6 years quietly shrinking around this man. I said, "Claire, I love you. And I want you to know that whatever happens, this house is yours when I'm gone. I've made sure of that." Scott's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Something tightened around his eyes. I said, "But I'm not moving to the basement." He started to speak. I held up one hand, not rudely, just firmly, the way my own father taught me. And I said, "Let me finish. You've been living in my home for 4 months. I've been happy to have you. But this is my home. Patricia and I built this life here. I'm not going to be relocated within my own walls to accommodate a conversation that should have been a conversation at finding you a larger apartment." Scott said that wasn't fair, that they were family, that with the baby coming, sacrifices had to be made. I said, "I agree, and I've been thinking about that. I'd like to offer you something." I had discussed this with Francis. I offered to help Claire and Scott with a down payment on a house of their own, a meaningful amount, enough to get them into something with proper space for a family, on 2 conditions. 1, it would be structured as a loan with formal documentation, not a gift. 2, they would need to be in their own place before the baby arrived. Scott stared at me. I said, "I want to help you build your life. I don't want to give you mine." Claire cried. She said she hadn't wanted any of this, that Scott had pushed for it, that she'd told him it wasn't right. Scott stood up from the table and said I was being difficult and that I clearly didn't care about my grandchild's well-being, and he walked out of the kitchen. Claire and I sat at the table for a long time after that. She said, "Did you mean it? About the house and about helping us?" I said yes to both. She said, "Scott's not going to like the loan idea." I said, "No, I don't imagine he will." She was quiet. Then she said, "He's been talking to his brother about this house, about the property value, about what it might be worth when you're—" She stopped. I said, "I know." She looked at me. "How do you know?" I told her about the phone call I'd overheard. I didn't tell her about the recordings, not yet. I just told her what I'd heard, and I watched her face go through something painful and necessary, the way a person's face goes when a thing they suspected is confirmed. She said very quietly, "I'm sorry, Dad." I told her she had nothing to apologize for. Over the next 2 weeks, things were tense. Scott didn't speak to me much. He spent more time on the phone in their room. He was reassessing his position. I could feel it, the way you feel weather changing. He was a man who had walked into a situation expecting a certain kind of opponent and found a different one. He made one more attempt. He came to the reading room one evening, which he had never done. He stood in the doorway and he looked at Patricia's books and he said he wanted to start over. He said he'd been stressed about money and the baby and he'd handled things wrong. He apologized, which cost him something, you could tell. Then he said he just thought that if I were to formally put the house in both his and Claire's names now, it would help with their financial planning, and it would just be a formality since it would come to Claire anyway. I said, "Scott, the house is already in a trust. Claire will inherit it entirely. You have no claim to it under Oregon law as a non-owner spouse, unless Claire chooses to grant you one, and that will be Claire's decision to make after I'm gone. There's nothing to sign over." The blood left his face in a way that told me everything I needed to know about his intentions. He left the reading room without another word. They found an apartment in June, a 2-bedroom in Beaverton, reasonable rent, decent school district for when the baby got older. I helped Claire move her things on a Saturday morning. Scott was there but stayed out of my way. When the truck was loaded, Claire hugged me for a long time in the driveway. She said, "I didn't know about most of it. I want you to know that." I told her I believed her. She said, "I'm going to do better. I know I let things go too far." I told her that becoming a mother had a way of clarifying things, that she'd be fine, that her mother would have been so proud. She started crying again, and I held her, and I thought about the height chart on the pantry door, and the dogwood tree, and the reading room. I still have the recordings. I have never needed to use them. Francis says to keep them. I intend to. Scott and Claire's son was born in August, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. They named him Arthur. I drove to the hospital, and I held him, and he grabbed my finger with his whole fist, the way newborns do. That reflex that has no intention behind it but feels like intention anyway. Claire looked at me from the bed, tired and radiant the way new mothers are, and she said, "He's going to know his grandfather." I said, "He'd better." I drove home that evening through Portland, through the late summer light that turns the whole city gold around 7 o'clock. And I pulled into my driveway, and I sat in the car for a minute before going inside. The house was quiet in the way it gets when it's just yours. The good kind of quiet. The kind that has your own life in it. Patricia's books were on the shelves. The dogwood was already setting up for its October slowdown. The kitchen had my coffee cup on the counter where I'd left it that morning. I went inside and I made dinner, and I sat at the oak table and I ate alone, which I've done many evenings since Patricia died, and which does not get easier but does get more familiar. I have not stopped being their family. I have Sunday dinners at their apartment once a month. I bring Arthur things. Not too much. I don't want to be that grandfather, but enough. Scott is polite to me in the careful way of a man who has revised his assessment of a situation. We will never be close. I don't require us to be. What I required was this house, this life, the reading room with the unfinished books, the dogwood in April, the coffee at 6. Nobody gives you your dignity back once you've handed it over. I learned that from my father, who learned it the hard way, and I have tried to remember it in every room of every building I have ever walked into. My daughter still folds herself small sometimes, but less than she used to, and when she looks at Arthur, something in her straightens. Something is clarifying, just like I told her it would. Patricia would have liked that. She would have liked all of this, I think, except maybe the part where it needed to happen at all. She always had better judgment about people than I did. She would have seen Scott coming from across a vineyard in Hood River. But she's not here to say so, so I had to see it for myself, in my own time, in my own way, and in the end, I stayed in my own bedroom, in my own house, with my own coffee cup on my own counter. That is enough. Some days it is everything.